Hi, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Leidy Klotz. Leidy is a professor at the University of Virginia who studies the science of design. He's authored over 80 original research articles, and his work has appeared in numerous outlets, including Nature, Science, The Washington Post, and Harvard Business Review. I invited Leidy on to talk about his latest book, Subtract, The Untapped Science of Less. In his book, Leidy details how the idea of subtraction is often overlooked when attempting to improve upon something or solve a problem. What was particularly interesting to me was how the idea of subtraction sort of fits into this category of a blind spot in human cognition. It's something that we all do, but may not notice until we pay some attention to it. We have a bias for adding, and it seems as though we can develop better and faster solutions for problems if we give equal weight to subtraction-based ideas. Also, I was glad to hear that an abstract concept like subtraction had so many practical and personal applications that could immediately make your life more efficient. I've spent a lot of time since my conversation with Leidy thinking about how to apply his ideas to my daily life, such as by removing apps from my phone that don't add value, or removing objects from my living space to create a simpler feel. I hope you're able to appreciate the values of subtraction after listening to our conversation. Enjoy. All right, joining me today is Leidy Klotz. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. This is going to be fun.
Yes, I hope so. So today we're going to be talking about your latest book, which is called Subtract, the Untapped Science of Less. I really enjoyed it. It basically takes an abstract idea of subtraction and applies it to a lot of real world problems and formulates ideas for how you can apply subtraction in your life to live a more fulfilling, better life. And I wanted you to start by just giving an overview of the premise of your book, and in particular, like what subtraction isn't, as you refer to it in your book, because it seems like there are lots of adjacent ideas to subtraction, and you're talking about a very specific principle. So why don't you give us an idea of what you're talking about when it comes to subtraction?
Yeah, well, first, you did a good job summarizing how the book takes this idea and tries to bring it to life. The key distinction is that it's an action, right? And so there's all this focus on minimalism and the end state of less, which isn't bad. I mean, that's amazing. I strive for that too. But there's less focus on this kind of act that is needed to get there, which is taking away. And so if you think about all these situations that we encounter in life, whether it's something small like just arranging our weekly calendar to something big like trying to adjust climate change, you're trying to take how things are and change it to how you want them to be. And their subtracting is a basic option when we're approaching problems, big and small. And it seems the premise of the book, I guess, is that we underuse subtraction, and that's a pretty rock solid premise because it's backed up by our own research that was published in Nature, which is not something that I commonly do or ever do, except for in this case, in part because of my great collaborators. But so we systematically overlook subtraction as a way to solve problems in all kinds of cases. And the book kind of jumps off from there and says, well, why is this the case? And now knowing this and knowing more about why this might be the case, how can we do better? How can we get better at using it? And again, it's not the only way to make change. It's just an overlooked way to make change. And as you said, it's not not the same as minimalism, because minimalism is the end state and subtracting is the way to get there and to get to so many other places.
I see. Right. So you dedicate a big chunk of the book talking about this sort of default tendency to neglect subtraction. One of the, before I even picked it up, I started thinking about, there's got to be some sort of evolutionary reason why we're neglecting subtraction, right? I mean, if you think of, or whether it's pre-human ancestors or any sort of organism, it's like the one thing that you need to do to survive is reproduce offspring, like more offspring, right?
Right.
So you talked about a couple different reasons why we neglect subtraction. What's the big one?
I mean, yeah, wanting to produce more offspring. Even before that, to be able to produce more offspring, you have to acquire food, for example, right? And so an instinct to eat and accumulate food and other things that kind of can relieve, can meet basic needs, it tends to be an evolutionary instinct. I mean, there's a study of pack rats hoarding nuts. Once their stash gets stolen, they automatically hoard nuts again. And you think, well, that's just what I do when my pantry goes bare. But the pack rats aren't thinking and deliberating, right? They don't have the capability to plan ahead. They're just hoarding the nuts based on instinct. And so there is, we share that with them. And then the other one that I think, and as you know, I mean, all of these, there are a lot of evolutionary forces, and the evolutionary forces overlap with cultural and, more socioeconomic ones that are more modern. But the other big evolutionary one is just this desire to display competence, I think. So the desire to show that you can effectively interact with the world. And that's a basic need, and the reason it's evolutionary advantageous is because if you can show you can effectively interact with the world, you're showing that you're potentially a good mate, somebody who would want to pass down genes with, and create the next generation. And so it wasn't surprising to me that competence was important, but it was surprising that it was so evolutionary grounded. I mean, one of the examples that I use in the book is the bowerbirds building these ceremonial nests, right? And they build the nests to, the males build the nest, the females come and look at the nests, and then the females decide which male to mate with based on what nest they like best. And then the females go build a nest to raise the young. So the whole point of the initial ceremonial nest was just to show that the male can effectively interact with the world. And this notion of displaying competence is something that we have. And it's also been more recently extended by Bandura, who's the famous psychologist, to task completion, right? So going to a meeting is a way to display competence, the way to display that we can effectively interact with our world. And it's easier to display competence by adding than it is by subtracting. When you subtract something, you very well may be effectively interacting with the world, but nobody sees it, which is an important loop to close for competence.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of all the, all of our hardwired preferences, right? They're not designed to address challenges of today. So like you said,
right.
I was picturing the peacock and having more feathers to attract mates. Like it's a waste of calories for peacocks to grow that
right.
large of a mane, but it does serve a purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you have other evolutionary ones that you think were rose to the level of competence and acquiring food?
Yeah, my brain kind of was thinking what you were about this, that stockpiling instinct. I think that was definitely the main thing, and how especially in scarcity. I mean, that's why it's so hard for humans nowadays to think of of these challenges because we have so many resources. I mean,
Right.
everyone we know probably doesn't have trouble with food or we have an abundance of resources. So it's kind of hard to put ourselves back into that state of, well, why is it that when we go to the store, we jump on a sale? It's because, there was a time in our evolutionary history where we didn't have all these resources.
Yeah. And that, that's a nice segue into the cultural layer, right? And so, and then when you talk about the start of human civilization, to become more civilized, there's no highway, there's no buildings. It makes sense to add the highway, add the buildings, to add the social structures, right? There's no rules. It makes sense to add rules. So for a long time, just it's starting from the start of civilization, it's also made sense to add things, and it's the same basic thing where now we're in a point where we have these new opportunities, on a long time scale, new opportunities to take things away, to make things better, and we're still kind of stuck with the same the mindset that has gotten us here.
Now, specifically thinking about the U.S. culture for a minute, some people would characterize U.S. culture as being very materialistic.
That would be a good characterization.
Exactly right. So this accumulation of stuff. How strong of a force do you think the specific culture plays in this tendency to neglect subtraction?
Well, we want to study it more, but also in our initial studies, this tendency to overlook subtraction, at least. So this is just not thinking about it. Never mind, once you think about it, you've got to choose it. We had a Japanese and a German sample in there, and the difference within those samples was more than the difference across samples. So the small amount of evidence that we do have across cultures suggests that this not thinking of it is pretty much is something that all cultures share. Now, not choosing it, I could see being having differences across cultures, right? Because once you think of subtracting as an option, then there are all these other forces where it's like, well, I know that this is the right thing to do, but I've got a incentive system, whether it's how you get paid at work or how people respect you in your neighborhood. You've got this incentive system to add rather than take away. And I imagine if those kind of cultural signals were different, right? If you live in a neighborhood with all, tiny homes, you're going to be more likely to have a tiny home. That's not a secret. Right. So yeah, I think for the thinking of it, the evidence, and my guess, a weak hypothesis, I guess, would be that it would be pretty similar across different cultures. And as you know, I mean, how you define cultures becomes a real, I think a person making $2 million a year in a very interdependent or Eastern culture is going to be different than a person, making $50,000 a year in one of those cultures. So I don't think that there would be major differences across cultures. I'm sure there would be nuanced differences, and we're interested in studying that more, letting somebody beat us to it and telling us what they find. But then in terms of choosing it, I think, certainly the norms around us are really powerful examples in what we follow through with and how we make change.
So we've talked about subtraction in the abstract. Could you just give us one of your favorite examples from the book that about the value of subtraction?
A really physical one is subtracting the wheels to make Strider bikes. So I had a 3-year-old at the time of writing the book. Now I have another 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old is 7. But so these Strider bikes are little miniature bikes that toddlers can ride because the inventor, Ryan McFarland, and the company is Strider Bikes, removed the pedals and the drivetrain. And so what happens is the toddler can, propel this like a Flintstone vehicle, and it turns out they know how to balance. They just don't have enough propulsion to turn the wheels. So it gives kids like an extra year or two of bike riding. It adds a ton of joy to the world. And then once they go to ride a big kid bike, they already know how to balance and just have to learn how to pedal. So it's an invention that's improved the world in non-trivial ways. It's made a lot of money for bike sellers. And it took a long time for people to think of it, is another reason I like the example, right? There are all these advances in bike technology over the years, but when I was growing up, there was not this option of a Strider bike, which all it would have taken was somebody to think to remove the pedals as a way to make a better bike. So that's a physical one. I think I think about this in three categories. One is, adding things. One is adding like social activities, right? So just a stop doing is a really simple one to illustrate it in your calendar. For example, it's like we spend so much time with our to-do lists, and crossing things off our to-do list, which is kind of a subtraction. A real subtraction would be a stop doing, right? And what are the things that you're currently doing that you are no longer going to do? Because if people are like me, it's just like too much stuff to do in the time that we have. And, just saying no to things is not going to relieve that problem. You also have to think about what you're currently doing that you can take away. So that's a social subtraction. And then ideas.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the social element, because I really liked in the book, you talked a little bit about the busy trap and how we, in my course, we talk a lot about time batching and proper planning of your week, and like you said, kind of what to remove. We're constantly surrounded by interruptions and other types of stimuli with our smartphone and stuff like that. And it's kind of degrading our attention. And, I think about it every day, especially with emails, right? So at my university, we're always trying to see we need to keep interacting, keep a constant flow of interaction with our students. And I was able to talk with one of the students one-on-one to see just how many messages they're getting from different departments at the university. And you see that how could you not be overwhelmed? And it's kind of, it was an easy opportunity for me to realize that less communication, a little bit less information could be more impactful. And it's one of those things that we often overlook.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are two levels there, right? One is as the receiver of information, we have to be good at filtering it and batching it and dealing with it, taking ownership of it, because this is, when the problem of too much information or people complaining about too much information is not new. Ever since people could write down words, people have said, well, this is going to be the death of thinking now that thoughts can be written down and stored that way. But certainly these new challenges with email and the technology have just, ramped up that problem even more, not problem, but the situation even more. And we've got to take ownership of filtering that. And, I think Cal Newport has a book called The End, A World Without Email. And then I really liked his book, Digital Minimalism, that talks about some of these practices that you can take. One of the things that I did after reading that was take social media off my phone. So I still have Twitter and LinkedIn, but I don't have it in my pocket. And that's kind of has made sense for me and helped kind of create one of those borders. So it's like the information is there, but I'm not, it's not interrupting my other thinking. I'd also say that the thing that might be a little new with the information is that most of the cost of the information is being borne by the recipient, right? And that's where, it used to be if you write a book, it takes forever to write a book. And then so it takes me all this time to write a book, and then I put it out there, and somebody spends 7 hours with it, which is so most of the cost is with me. But with the emails, for example, it's like you write an email and you send it out to thousands of people, and you've created all this information. So the time it takes to read the email times the number of people that you've sent it to, and the cost is with that person. And so as senders of emails, we need to be conscious of that, right? I mean, yes.
Yeah, there's lots of people that, you kind of feel like they're time thieves, right? They're just sort of,
but it's easy to do that.
Hostage, yeah.
And it's 99% of it is well-being, right? You think about it, it's well-meaning. When you send an email, you're trying to provide information to somebody that might be useful to them, but it's not going to a vacuum. They're also getting 50 other emails. So how important is this compared to the other ones? How important is this compared to the one you're going to send the next day? Also, I found, I don't know if I got this from digital minimalism or not, but just batching when I send emails has been really helpful for my receipt of emails, because it stems the flow of my emails. Some of the things get resolved in the time between when I would have sent it and when I actually get around to sending it. And, it gives other people the signal that I'm not expecting them to respond to this right away. They don't always have to be on with their email, because a lot of the times the people you're emailing are people you want to be doing other work than responding to your emails. So
you mentioned that you said domain number 1 is adding and subtracting things. Then domain number 2 is adding and subtracting in a social sense. What is your third category?
Ideas, basically. So in the way we build knowledge in our minds, or construct knowledge, right, it's an even additive metaphor that we use for it. And we take new information and we scaffold it onto the mental models that are already in our head. And of course, that's kind of like building the history of civilization. It's long been a good thing, right? It's long been good to add new information, but the more information you add, the more opportunity there is to kind of revisit some of these things that your mental models are built upon, and see if they need to be revised or subtracted. And that, is a really hard thing to do. It takes it faces all the same barriers as subtracting in the physical world, right? It's hard to think of it, but then even after you do think of it, there's emotional attachment to the things that you might take away, and it requires change. At the same time, it's often the more powerful way to change your thinking, because adding one more thing is pretty incremental, but if you can subtract some wrong construct that you've been building everything upon, that can be really transformative in your thinking.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book the triage in the ER. Could you talk a little bit about that example? That's what my head went to when you were saying ideas and subtracting and streamlining type things.
Yeah. And so like the triage in the ER, I mean, basically people come into the emergency room. My sister's an emergency room doctor, and she uses the triage process to understand how they should be kind of allocated into the hospital. And it's a very simple 4-step process. And of course, it's a nice illustration of, kind of working memory and then longer term memory, where the basic steps of triage are very simple, but of course behind that, she's got all this hard-earned information that she learned through her medical degree and through her experience that is informing those decisions. But the simple steps of the triage are things that she can use in the moment, while making those decisions. Another example is from the medical field is like checklists. Catheter insertions create a lot of infections and lead to people dying from something that an infection that they didn't have when they came into the hospital. And there are all kinds of ways to do a better catheter insertion. But the way that this problem has been solved in many places is by a checklist, which took all of these procedures and, best practices for inserting catheters and narrowed it down to, just a few steps that doctors and nurses can make sure that they follow. And again, it's, it's avoiding missing the forest for the trees. It's saying, here are the key things that you can do to keep in your working memory when you're doing this task.
Do you think it's harder to come up with these types of solutions, in the sense of, because I'm picturing the process of like overhauling a medical sort of checklist and stuff like that. It's like, if you were to take a group of people and try to improve upon this process, it's like anyone can yell out an idea, but it takes a little bit more critical thinking to examine what's already there in detail, right? Because that's like an extra step. Yeah,
no, that's a beautiful illustration of a general principle with subtracting. Is it's harder in two ways. One is just more work, right? Because to subtract something, you've got to take two steps. That person has to yell out the idea, and then somebody else has to say, let's get rid of it. Or that person has to say, let's get rid of it, right? So something has to be added first, whereas to add, you just need to have added. And then it's harder cognitively, or it's harder to come up with a good subtraction because you need to actually understand the whole system, right? And so you can add something without understanding what the hell's going on in the basic system, right? It's just like, throw bacon on this, it's going to make it better. Well, but to subtract something, you actually
I agree with that one. Let's not subtracting bacon has never helped anything. Adding bacon always helps, right?
Bacon. But if you've got this like complex system, in this case, an emergency room, for example, you can't just come in and say, oh, well, let's stop doing catheter insertions, right? Like, you've got to really understand all of the things and the way that system is working. And oftentimes there are invisible kind of forces in the system, right? It's not obvious to an outsider what the whole system is and what could be subtracted. So yeah, harder in two ways. One is just more steps. Two, it requires a more complete understanding of the system, whereas adding, you can just do without understanding.
Well, and it's also interesting that you said, well, don't remove catheter insertions, but sometimes like the problem is to stop doing a procedure. I mean, if you think of like, for example, like CAT scans, I remember, I don't know, it could have been 5-10 years ago at this point, where the recommendation on CAT scans was like, we're not going to do CAT scans in these cases because the cost outweighs the benefit of, we're not going to just do this for, head injury without certain types of symptoms and stuff like that. And so sometimes the solution might be the unthinkable. And it was kind of something I was thinking about while reading your book, was this concept of functional fixedness, and how we take objects and oftentimes we just interpret them using our default ways of interpreting them. And we see a bucket, we don't see an arced metal piece and something that you could stand on. We just see a bucket that's holding liquid. Did you think of that type of thinking, that functional fixedness? Did that come up as you were putting together the book?
The relation in my mind between this and functional fixedness is that functional fixedness is obviously there's a ton of behavioral science and psychology that is relevant to design. My degrees are in engineering, and I teach engineering and architecture students along with other kinds of students. But and so a lot of what we talk about is design, and there's all these concepts from psychology that don't make their way over to design that could be helpful in design. Functional fixedness, on the other, is actually one that did make that transition over, right? It's like, this is a classic psychology finding, but it's also something that designers will learn about. And so I think that this is analogous in that the exploration of why don't we, why don't we subtract when we're trying to change things from how they are to how we want them to be? That's a design framing, right? It's basically saying, when we're designing, why don't we subtract? I'd see that is kind of the analogy. Where I thought you might go with the is like just the bias towards doing, right? If you do the CAT scan and nothing's wrong, you don't get blamed. But if you don't do the CAT scan and there's and there turns out to be something that you could have discovered on the CAT scan, that's like, heads roll for that.
Sure.
And so I think that that is definitely I forget the psychological term for that, but that kind of bias, or that like that is something that definitely privileges doing and forms of doing that are adding.
So staying on health a little bit, one of the things that popped in my head while I was going through your book is our tendency to neglect subtraction in terms of nutrition. So, I have lots of, I hang out at a lot of dive bars. And so I hang out with some people that consume a lot of alcohol. And one of the things that I've noticed with them is that they love to approach their health issues, whether it's lethargy or lack of sleep or something like that. They like to add like a vitamin or a pill or even I got a new Fitbit because I want to monitor my steps and such. And it's super interesting because the solution is right in front of them. It's like, or you could drink less or stop drinking or something like that. Were there any other health examples that came to mind when you were researching?
Yeah, I mean, that one is it's so like in your face when you think about it, right? So I totally agree with your example there. I think the fasting is another one, right? And so that's, even people who are healthy have started exploring that as a way to become even healthier, right? Is to try this kind of temporary fasting, so that's an example of subtracting to become healthier, in addition to just like not eating as much or not drinking as much, or kind of cutting out the things that are bad for you. The other health one, this didn't make it into the book, but it goes to like just the prescribing of drugs. And I've heard this from a lot of doctors, that it's just so much easier to prescribe a new drug than it is to evaluate all of the cocktail of drugs that people are already taking and decide to take some away. And so it's not like they don't know that it's a problem, but it's kind of back to that complex system thing where if somebody comes to them with 6 drugs, that they're taking, that are being prescribed, and has a problem, then the doctor tries to like uses them with the 6 drugs as the present state, because it just takes more time to think about, oh, well, maybe like if I got rid of 3 of these drugs and added 1, they would only be on 4 drugs and have their problem solved in a better way, when it's easier to just say, okay, let's prescribe this other drug that we think will solve the problem that's presenting itself.
That reminds me. So one of the principles that you kind of do a deep dive in, that you do a deep dive about in the book, is satisficing. So this principle that there's, I guess what I would say is like there's a sweet spot when you're trying to solve a problem. I don't know any other better way to put it. But this idea that there's, it reminds me of all the research on happiness and how, like, there's a thing as too much. You have too much, or you need, you need the best, right? And that there's a downside by pointing your arrow in one direction, trying to obtain the best and more, and that there's a sweet spot. Could you talk a little bit about satisficing?
Yeah, I mean, and satisficing is, Herbert Simon, one economist and did a lot of behavioral decision science research, won a Nobel Prize for this. They kind of like the first era of what's now the Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, beyond rationality stuff. And so Simon showed that there are a lot of cases where it's perfectly logical not to come up with the optimal solution, right? The optimal solution that math would suggest it. I mean, I think about this, and when I go, now it's online, but when you're shopping for groceries, right? There are 100 kinds of spaghetti sauce available. And yeah, you could sit there and create a decision matrix to say, okay, which one like optimizes on price, calories, salt content, and taste. Or you could, pick the first one you see that is less than $5 and it doesn't have more than 25% of your sodium content, and then allows you to move on and do the rest of your shopping, right? Because for decisions like that, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of cognitive effort on them. And so you can, what Simon said was that a lot of times it's like this imperfect satisfying makes perfect sense, or imperfect satisficing makes perfect sense. And so how that ties into adding and subtracting, right, is number one, as our research showed, adding is our first instinct, right? And so we add, and then it's not that we can't think of subtracting, it's just that adding comes to mind first. So if you add, and that's a good enough solution, if that's a satisfied solution, you're like, all right, on to the next thing. I mean, I think about this in writing. It's pretty easy to write an email that gets the point across, and you're like, okay, good enough, send. And it might be a better email if you could subtract 3 of the 10, even if it's a 10-word email, you could subtract 3 words to make it shorter, but you just don't have the cognitive effort to do that. So, you don't want to devote the cognitive effort to doing that. Right. And so so satisficing, to the extent that it takes more effort to think of subtracting, and we tend to satisfice in some of our decisions, satisficing is going to lead to more adding than subtracting. That wasn't a beautiful explanation, but it's a
I like that you addressed it, because I'm obsessed with balance, which is perfect title for your next book, right? Just you got balance, subtract, balance,
and then add,
right? But yeah, this idea that that if you look at enough problems, this you tend to find these solutions in the middle, across the board, right? Whether it's food, just arbitrarily picking food, like there's eating too much, or having just eating too much, or on the other end, it's too much energy around food where you're too restrictive, right? And like the sweet spot is, you try to eat balanced meals, and then occasionally you can have the snack or something like that. And it, that was one of the things I was thinking of when I came across this section on satisficing.
I mean, it just also mirrors with the subtracting takes more thought. So the most straightforward explanation of where satisficing ties in here is that, we've been shown to, and it makes sense to only devote to not devote all of our cognitive resources to every problem. And so when we're making these satisfice decisions, and we don't devote more cognitive resources, we're more likely to stop at the first instinct, which is adding.
Mm-hmm. So how do we avoid over subtracting, right? So if you look in 2022, we have apps on our phones that deliver us food. We can hire maid services. We don't have to go to the store to rent a video anymore. We just click a few buttons. We've made so much progress streamlining things that we've determined these nice little technological solutions, so we don't have to do them anymore. Everything's faster. But if you really dig deep into this solution, we've kind of made these activities less satisfying. Back in the day, if you had to go get in the car to go get a steak or something like that, there was so much more effort to do that, and then because of the effort, the reward was that much more rewarding. So if we've naturally made all these changes to modern life through technology, how do we avoid cutting out too much so that there is no hard work, there's no feeling of work to these pursuits?
Yeah, I mean, I'm agnostic on whether you should subtract or not, right? I mean, that is, once you've thought of this, then by all means, do what you think is best for you. And I don't think it's certainly not the answer in all situations. And I would even, if I had to pick adding or subtracting to only do for the rest of my life, it would be adding. But I don't. And so it's the main message is consider both of these things, and like you said, balance. How do we have a balance? These are complementary ways to change things from how they are to how we want them to be. I'd say with the technology, one of the things that comes up in engineering a lot is this notion of efficiency, right? And it's not really subtracting. It's more like you're taking something away, but it's not to take something away to make it better. You're taking something away so that you can do more, so that you can add even more stuff. And I think some of the technology examples fall into that category, right? It's like by taking away your example of if this app makes it so that you no longer get to interact with the waitress and the hostess and the restaurant owner, that's not making the situation better. And it's just making it faster and allowing you to move on to something else that will be faster. So I agree with you completely that subtracting is not the answer in all situations. I would say that one, though, might not even fit into the category in my mind, because it's not by definition making the situation better. It's actually making the situation worse. But yeah, it is something to be wary of. I'm not worried that we're gonna overdo subtraction anytime soon, but right. it is true that there are things, it's not always better.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you whether or not you cut out any chapters and whether or not you regretted cutting out that chapter.
I haven't regretted cutting anything out. It's hard to break it into chapter. I mean, I've definitely cut out the equivalent amount of words as about 3 chapters, actually. So I would say the book is about 70,000 words, and definitely 30,000 words of excerpts that are never going to see the light of day, maybe even more. And so yeah, I cut and I don't regret it. If anything, it's like wish I could have cut more, but it takes time. It's hard work. Yeah.
So at the end of the book, you sort of lay out sort of this step-by-step process. So you condense everything down for takeaways.
Yeah.
Could you talk about these? Because I think this was the practical kind of approach to examining your life through a different lens.
Yeah.
What were those?
Hopefully I get them right. You can fill in if, but it was, so I think, the basic steps, and, they make sense when you read the book, and hopefully I can make them make sense now too. That, so the first one is again, subtract before you act. And this gets to the systemic nature of all these issues that we're trying to improve. So oftentimes we are the very situation that we're trying to make better can be improved by, streamlining our mental model of it, right? So can we simplify our mental model of this situation? So that's an example of that is the emergency room checklists, right? So it's here's this thing that we want to improve, but to start improving it, we need to remove all of this extraneous detail, or filter out the extraneous detail and just put the important parts of the system front and center. And then the next step is to subtract first. So it's the whole problem with our thinking process here is that we think of adding first, and then because we Satisfice, we move on, right? So if you think of subtracting first, you've solved that problem. I don't think there's any danger that you're not then going to consider adding, and you've kind of forced yourself to think of think of the thing that we might otherwise overlook. I use Jenga as an example for this, because if you there's a lot of Lego examples in the book too, and Legos you're just kind of infinitely building with, and Jenga, of course, the whole rule of the game is you have to take something away before you add it back on top, and that creates a very different type of system than the Lego infinite expansion system. So subtract first, then it keeps subtracting. So yeah, and this ties back to the well, you actually did a really good job walking us through these examples, because now I can tie back to them. So this ties back to the competence thing, right? So we talked about how there's a disadvantage in displaying competence through subtracting. It's harder to get people to notice it. But it's not that people can't see subtracting. If you do enough subtracting, and a lot of the examples that you think of, like minimalist architecture, for example, or I use Bruce Springsteen, one of his albums in my book, that's like Darkness on the Edge of Town. It's really a stripped down album. And and the point is that if you subtract enough, people notice. The Apple products, same thing, right? It's like, if Steve Jobs had removed one feature from the dominant computer, nobody would have noticed that he removed one thing. But when you strip it all the way down to this thing, that's like, oh man, that's different. There is competence there. Some thought went into taking those things away. So that's the keep subtracting. It can help you show competence, and reveals more opportunities. And then the last one is a nice one to end on, because we've talked a lot about the systematic disadvantages that subtracting faces. I mean, it's not visible. It's we don't think of it at first, but we can reuse our subtractions, and that's an advantage that adding doesn't have. And I think of donut holes for this one. And so donuts for a really long time were just like smashed pieces of dough with no hole in the middle. And then there's all these legends about how the hole got started. And but basically, once there's a hole in the middle, they cook more evenly. There's more space to spread delicious sugar on. And so it's definitely an improvement that took a long time to think of by subtracting. But then not only do you have this donut, but you've got the leftover piece of dough, which can be its own kind of source of income and source of delight, right? You can sell donut holes. So when you think about removing, you remove something from your calendar, that is something, that space that you can reuse. When you remove physical things, that's you can, or don't use physical things, that's a physical resource that you can use in some other way. So the last step is to remember that you can reuse your subtractions.
Thank you so much for walking us through the book. Once again, it is called Subtract: The Untapped Science of Less. I just really enjoyed the concept, and how it sort of allows me now to look at the world through a different lens. That's what I felt. That's what I felt after finishing this. Thank you again for being on, Leidy Klotz.
Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. And your interview, it will allow me to look at the world through a different lens too. So that's the nicest compliment you could pay the book. So I'll pay it back for this conversation.
For more on Leidy, visit his website, LeidyKlotz.com. That's LeidyKlotz.com. Or purchase his latest book, Subtract: The Untapped Science of Less, wherever books are sold. Be sure to follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on iTunes. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. As always, feel free to email me at whydowedothatpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?